Hello and welcome to the channel. I will tell you interesting scary stories from Reddit and not only. Do not forget to support the author of the story. I will leave his credits in the description. I also hope for your support of my channel in the form of likes and comments. I really appreciate it. Get comfortable in your bed, put on your headphones, and turn off the lights. It's going to be a night of nightmares. We're starting. My name is Preston. I am 102 years old, and my days are spent between walls shrinking towards me, an ever-encompassing reminder of the vast abyss that awaits me when I breathe my final breath. But I didn't come here for pity or for your damn sympathies. I'm not here for your assistance or to tell you a story. No, this is a warning. I dropped into this world with a grudge and something to prove. The war raged on. Despite the shrill cries of my dying mother, I was the runt of a family plagued by the desolation of Herr Fritz's ambitions, and communications so appalling the treaties that started the whole thing might as well have been written by the illiterate drunk I called father. Somehow, through the food shortages, the loss of life, and the general barbarism of the time, I survived. The mercy of my sisters kept me from starving until I was capable of fending for myself, and by then, I'd learned to subsist on the forces of anger and sheer will. My father was, as I mentioned, a drunk, and an abusive one at that. Thankfully, he didn't make it out of the trenches, but he filled me with enough trauma to last me a lifetime before he shipped out to fight the Huns. Despite the devastating effect on the landscape of the world, the war came and went, leaving boys like me to clean up the wreckage. All of that anger, rage, and resentment shaped me, and I poured it into my work. Trucks filled with scrap metal, thousands upon thousands of concrete bricks, unskilled and scantily paid labor made up the bulk of my education. Though unlike my father, I took the initiative and taught myself to read. Two things happened on my 18th birthday. We received the official letter declaring my father dead, and Germany invaded Poland. I'm ashamed to say it out loud, but back then I was grateful to the fucking Nazis. Don't take it the wrong way. I don't hate Jews or anything. Shit. I married a gypsy that survived the death camps. But the war, well, war gave me a chance to escape the miserable existence I called life. I signed up immediately. The Royal Air Force became my new home. I wasn't a large man by any means, but strong enough to make an effective grunt. Mostly, I built airplanes. There was plenty of heavy lifting to be done, and unlike many of the other disgruntled young men who enlisted, I didn't want to kill anyone, Nazi or not. Of course, I did kill some Nazis. Everyone did eventually. But I didn't want to take anyone's life. I was convinced that killing a man, regardless of that man's own moral fiber, would forever damn me to hell. My soul didn't seem to slip from my grasp after I dispatched my first Nazi. And I'm certain I knew right from wrong after I notched the last. But, again, this isn't some silly tale about how I couldn't adjust to life after the war and tried to recapture the thrills of battle, slowly descending into a pattern of serial killing, or some fucked up shit like that. No, like I said, this is a warning that hell is real, terribly so, but it's not the devil that condemns you to an eternity of fire and brimstone. Not even close. After the war, I stayed in France, near the border of Germany. I got heavily involved in the rebuilding efforts, the one thing it seemed that I was good at doing. The reconstruction of the road system that connected Europe was the most pressing task in the beginning, to prevent people from starving and get trade flowing between nations once more. The road crew I joined crossed over into Germany every once in a while, and we spent most of our time waiting on the Americans that were heading up the relief efforts We often jumped from project to project, working for a few weeks, and then moving on to a new reconstruction site. Because the camp moved around so frequently, we operated mostly out of temporary shelters and tents. We attracted a large number of gypsies due to this movement pattern, and thank God for that. I would never have met my beloved Maria if it weren't for our frequent work with the Romanis. I wouldn't trade that for the world. Then again, most days, I don't think about Freddy. Would you believe me if I told you that evil, true evil, had a forgettable face? That was Freddy, utterly forgettable. He wasn't unattractive, but he wasn't the prom king by any stretch of the imagination. He didn't speak very often, content to listen to the gripes of his fellows. He laughed along with most of our jokes, and very rarely lost the short, upturned smile that played casually across his face. Even in the mud and rain, with back-breaking, thankless labor, Freddy always looked as though he'd just received pleasant news. Everyone loved him, confided in him, and on the few occasions he wasn't around, missed his simple smile. Darkness had already set in the night Maria's caravan passed by our work camp. Our foreman, slightly too drunk, invited them to join us. We were behind schedule, and it came as little surprise when the foreman began offering up work. Strange, maybe, but those were strange times. We'd just defeated the human embodiment of evil, and the world was turning into something different, something new. People weren't so critical of each other, at least not in the majority. The victory brought people that normally would not mix into closer proximity to each other. Necessity breeds human compassion. It always has. A few of the men accepted the work, and the caravan dropped their stakes on the other side of the unfinished road. Some of the women and children offered to prepare some real food for our camp, and we chomped at the bit for a taste of a home-cooked meal. That's the night I met Maria. She was heaven sent, truly. Her skin, kissed by the sun ever so gently, showed no sign of age or malnutrition, but for the tattoo visible on her left arm, you would never have guessed that she survived one of the German death camps. I would find out later in life that she barely survived, but that's a story for another time. Maria looked so lovely, as if pure happiness danced within her veins. When she handed me a bowl, I barely managed to stammer out a thank you before she graciously smiled and moved on to the next worker. The love of my life served each of us with help from her family and friends. But despite her beauty, I knew none of the other laborers saw her as a gilded goddess, dancing through the rubble of civilization, spooning life into wooden bowls without a thought for thanks or recompense. No one else saw the grace in her steps, nor the purity of strength behind her smile. None but me and Freddy. The other workers had wives, loves of their own somewhere. That, or they cared little for the love of a woman and craved more carnal pleasures. And I, so long alone in the world, had long given up hope of ever knowing the sweetness of love. Yet there she stood, laughing and eating with the men who would sooner defile her and leave than see her betrothed. She was elegance afoot. The way her legs carried her as she glided through the group of us, dancing and charming each man with the same ease with which you or I breathe. She could have been a prima ballerina if she'd been given a different life. And when she invited me to join her dance, I found myself rooted in place, unable to take even the slightest step towards her. In that instant, I resigned myself to the heartbreaking reality that I, Preston Whately, would never see such ambrosial loveliness again. Short of celestial intervention, I would spend the remainder of my life acrimonious and alone. Cold, harsh breath hit the back of my neck, and a firm grip clamped down on my shoulder. Freddie stood beside me, a look of reassuring empathy betrayed only marginally by the pressure in his grip. If windows are eyes to the soul, I saw in that moment that Freddie was more than the man that hid behind his smile. His eyes were smoldering embers, pieces of wood long lost, to the dreadful decay of the flame. His pupils swirled in shadowy darkness and spoke of the astonishing and perilous void. Parting his lips, two thin pieces of red, stark against the drained pigment of his face, his tongue split as a serpent's, teased his true nature. Too alarmed to respond, I felt as he drew himself just behind my left ear. Only half of his body remained in my periphery, and as he spoke, the unnatural touch of frost from his breath sent me weak at the knees. "She is the most beautiful creature I have seen in a long time," he whispered, barely audible over the commotion surrounding us. "You desire her as I do," he said with confidence, the sort that I could not manage to muster. His grip tightened on my shoulders, morphing from slight discomfort to intentionally painful. He rested his chin on my left shoulder, that damn tongue-wicking left and right from the corner of my eye. "We're friends, are we not?" he asked coyly. I could barely keep myself from fainting, never mind speak. After a tense few seconds passed, I managed a nod. And friends help each other. He spoke with a surety that countermanded the once soft kindness that I'd come to associate with Freddie's simple demeanor. His words dripped with honey and venom, tempting with each syllable he uttered. "All you have to do, friend, is say the word. I can make her heart yours until the day she dies." He seemed so genuine, so sincere. In spite of his appearance and the dread it inspired in my heart, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he could and would do as he said. All I had to do was say yes. "I'll let you think on it, but not for too long now." He stepped around me, pressing his cheek into mine. His tongue flitted in my ear. "The caravan will move on in 2 days' time. She will leave, and by the time you muster up the courage to track her down, her heart will belong to another." He kissed me gently on the forehead, his appearance returning to the normal, unremarkable man I'd grown to know. He rejoined to revelry, leaving me in the darkened outskirts of the camp to ponder, as though nothing had happened. Night quickly over took both camps, and my inconsequential presence was hardly missed. Maria returned to her camp, warm and full of smiles. She even graced me with a friendly glance as she passed. I worshipped her, watching her long after she faded from view. The remainder of the work crew tipsily stumbled back towards the bunks, but still I was fixed in place. I weighed my decision well into the evening, before eventually drifting off into a starlit sleep. The light of the sun peeked over the horizon, stirring me from a tumultuous rest. Freddie stood over me, a hand extended in aid. I took his hand, our conversation the night before. A distant thought, a dream quickly fleeing from my conscious mind. We went to work. The labor was harder than ever, the fresh, crisp winds of autumn slowly shifting towards the harsher mistress winter. The caravan workers came in fewer numbers that day, mostly the very youngest of them. Dotted here and there with a few senior members. By the end of the working day, word got around that the caravan was planning to set off soon. It seemed that, even though the pay was decent, they tired of the countryside. In the cities, especially ones the size of Paris, they could earn 10 times as much, what with their interesting tales and exotic allure. There was no doubt in my mind that their women were the real breadwinners. I sat around the campfire that night, my mind a million miles away. I simply couldn't reconcile my feelings. On the one hand, I wanted so desperately to trust my friend, to believe every word he'd spoken to me the night before. On the other, the rational part of my brain knew that it had all been a dream, a flight of fancy spurred on by desperation and anxiety. Whatever Freddie thought he could do to make her love me, I was sure it wouldn't work. After all, it's not like he could have done much but talk me up. I strolled over to his tent, pushing away the nagging anxiety that told me to flee, to run like hell and forget Freddie, Maria, and the whole damn thing. This is fucking silly, I told myself. Freddie is just a guy, like anyone else. He'll just go tell Maria a sob story. She'll feel sorry for me, and maybe I'll get a kiss. And then she'll go, and I'll stay here, too cowardly to go after her. As I turned to go back to the fire, well convinced of my own idiocy, the rustling of the tent flap stopped me in my tracks. Made a decision, have you? I thought for a second that I misheard him. Freddie had neither a lisp nor a stutter, but before I could say anything, he draped his arm around my shoulder, turning us both towards the freshly paved road. Yes, I said softly. He looked at me, my eyes giving him a clear answer. You have to say it, friend. Say the words. We stopped at the roadside, the makeshift divide between our camp and theirs. My throat caught on the words, and as they finally croaked out, I felt a terrible tremble bounding through my body. Yes, I want her. Please help me. He gripped my hand a little too quickly, as if I would change my mind if I thought on it for another second. We have an accord, my friend. He walked back towards the work camp, quietly calling over his shoulder. Tomorrow night, be right here around 3:30 in the morning. Just do what comes naturally, and you'll have your wish. I was wrought with anticipation all the next day. Freddie acted, the he always did, a quiet engine, ceaselessly working until the job was complete. Dinner came and went, just as quickly as the workday, leaving me with hours of nothingness and nervous thought. Eventually the hour arrived. There I stood, feeling naked in the utter silence of the night. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing but the sounds of crickets in the night greeted me. As the clock loomed towards 4, my hope began to fade. Of course, the whole crew was probably waiting in the bushes, ready to burst into mocking laughter as soon as I turned back towards camp, hopeless and defeated. I didn't hear it at first, but as I turned back towards my tent, the sounds of soft whimpering crawled into my ears. It was strange, like the sound of a mewing cat, only muffled and distant. I followed the sound, up the road, and closer toward the uneven ground we'd been working on the last few days. But for the few emergency lights hung up around the construction site, it was pitch black. We'd had to hang the lights a few weeks back, lest another drunken worker fall into a pit and break his neck. I could just barely make out the silhouette of someone sitting at the edge of the light. "Hey, you shouldn't be over here. It's dangerous," I shouted out, stomping closer. I pulled out my flashlight and prepared my harshest parent face. Most likely one of the caravan's kids were out too late, playing around in the dirt. It certainly wouldn't be the first time. We'd caught them a couple of times playing around the equipment. I'd tell them off, they'd scamper home. All's well that ends without a dead child, right? I flicked on the light and froze. It wasn't a child. Maria wore the most gnarled face as she looked up at me, her eyes devoid of the light that made her so irresistible. There was dirt in her hair, as if she'd been struggling, and her arms were covered in it. She looked to be in a wretched amount of pain, but a slippery, pale hand held over her mouth muted her cries. I shined the light further down her torso, following the hand down to its source. Freddy, or at least the thing with Freddy's eyes, held Maria by her mouth and left arm. His arms were broken and contorted, resembling some sort of insectoid abomination. I stared into her pleading eyes and followed the light even further down. I do not know how to describe the horror that sat before me. Maria was being pinned to the ground as the thing slowly engorged her legs. He wasn't chewing them, he wasn't eating her. His jaw was displaced and stretched impossibly wide. Hideous green slime dripped from his mouth as he slowly, methodically, pushed himself around her thighs. With each thrust, another bit of his mouth wrapped around Maria's form. I bolted towards the creature, grabbing the nearest large rock as I left the road. I may not have been able to speak to a beautiful woman, but I knew how to kill an enemy. I slammed the rock into the creature's face. It seemed to chuckle, but it came out as a spattering gargled sound. Again and again. I crushed the rock into the creature's skull, but it seemed to barely leave a mark. It shot me a look. The creature's eyes burned brightly now, lidless and serpentine. He was enjoying this. There was a loud crack, and I heard Maria cry out in agony. The green fluids muddled with blood as the creature let her sobbing body slump lifelessly against the dirt. He stood, facing me, his jaw slacked down to his stomach and arms, nearly grazing the upturned roadside. With a series of grotesque muscle contractions, his body took on a more human shape. I squeezed the rock in my hand, tears of hot rage flowing from my eyes. He wiped his mouth, her blood, and his green saliva, quickly staining what was left of his tattered clothing. He belched, quickly donning a polite, embarrassed smile, as if I'd caught him stuffing his face with the last piece of cake. "You're welcome to try to kill me, if you like," he spoke, brushing the dust from his shirt. He unbuttoned his pants, and I nearly saw red, but he gave off a soft tisk as he tucked his shirt back into his trousers. "If you try, however, you won't succeed. Then you will both meet with the same delicious end," he hissed, not bothering to hide his forked tongue. "Or, and you'll have to act quickly, you can tourniquet her stumps," he smiled. "Your choice. Though if she lives, she will love you with undying passion until the very last day of her life." We both knew what I chose. I dropped the rock and Freddy patted me on the shoulder. He stood there for a long while, watching as I frantically ripped apart my clothes, trying desperately to turn them into makeshift tourniquets. She was losing blood so quickly, there was not a single second to spare. It took nearly a half hour, but I managed to get her stable enough to move back to the camp. If I could get her there, to medical supplies, and anesthetic, she would have a chance. I held her in my arms and marched past Freddy, still sitting there smiling and picking his teeth. "You're welcome, friend," he called out, but I didn't stop. "I'd do my best to die first, you hear?" He laughed loudly, without a shred of mercy in his bones. Maria, I am happy to say, did survive. Thank God. The medical supplies back at the camp, and her parents' hastily given blood transfusion, spelled the recipe for stabilizing her. I explained about Freddy. No, I didn't say anything about him being a snake demon from the blackest pits of hell. I made up a story, and then I chose to save Maria's life, rather than chase him down. No one questioned it. Freddy had disappeared by the time a crew went out looking for him. Maria was grateful when she finally woke. She didn't remember a thing, except for my face when I shined the light on them. I paid for all her necessary treatments. I even stayed with the caravan for an entire year after she was released from the hospital. And true to his disgusting, corrupted word, she loved me, and I loved her so much. Eventually we decided it would be easier to settle down somewhere, though I could see in her eyes that the idea killed a part of her. I built her a small cottage outside of Paris. Her family spent many nights camped on our property. We had a happy life and a loving marriage. Over the years, we shared many wonderful memories, and a family of our own cropped up, slowly around us. We laughed together and we cried, and we taught our eventual children the true definition of devotion. But eventually, our time ran out. It always does. And to the everlasting pain in my heart, Maria's hourglass ran out of sand, long before my own. Freddie was right, even after all of the horror. I should have worked harder to die first. If you've ever had a lover cheat on you, then you might be able to comprehend the way she looked at me right before she died. But I truly doubt it. It was as if she was remembering a dream, the way it suddenly crashed down on her. Her affect changed instantaneously, and I trembled. As she struggled to take her final breaths, surrounded by friends and family, she started to croak out hoarse words. Her eye burned with a searing fire. She lunged at me as I tried to comfort her, mistaking her anger for pain. As the life left her body, she shrieked at me. "You bastard!" She wheezed through the oxygen mask, new life given to her temporarily, that she might say these final words. "You stole my legs. It was you, you sick fuck. How dare you?" And then she was gone. No one believed it, of course. The deluded ramblings of a woman leaving her body. She was full of morphine and barely coherent. After all, I'd been an amazing husband and a wonderful father and grandfather. My children, and their children, gathered around me in comforting grace just like their mother. But I knew the truth. I knew then, as I know now, it was my fault. Somewhere out there, Freddie is waiting for me. I made a deal with the demon and the bill came due. So, there it is, my warning. There's a creature, a devil, that lurks in the dismal places of the world. He is handsome but not remarkable, quiet but hardly shy. He's easy to befriend and even easier to trust, and he will gladly help you if you're his friend. He'll reach straight for the passions burning deepest on your heart, and he will ask you simply to say the words, "For God's sake, whatever you do, please don't say yes."